So I had two profound experiences. One is a mystical experience, and one is an NDE, and near-death experiences. So the NDE happened in the first week of COVID, and you inhale something, and within 10 seconds, the visual field starts fractioning, and turns black into this black hexagonal, and you dive down into this hole, into this black hole, and then everything disappears. In a sense that the body is gone, the sense of self is gone, passage of time is gone, so the moment doesn't feel too long or too short, it simply is. There's no sounds, there's no smells, there's no pain, there's no pleasure. In my case, there were three things. There was a bright light of overwhelming intensity. Some people interpret it as a light at the end of the tunnel, but there was no tunnel. There was just this bright light. And then there was this god-awful terror and ecstasy, this combination of terror and ecstasy. And both lasted, they lasted. There wasn't any duration to this. Later on, I discovered when I came through, it was sort of about 10 minutes, this experience. This is a rather intense experience. And, I think about it every day. And it's taught me a few things. It's taught me, A, that I was always correct in assuming that you see, in this moment, there was no self, there was no Christof, there wasn't, a reduced sense of Christof. There was just nothing. I wasn't a man or woman or child or God or an animal or rock. That just wasn't there. And there was no external world. I wasn't dimly aware. There was just nothing except this pain and the ecstasy and this bright light. And so it taught me that self is optional. And it left me very confused, in a sense. How could I explain that? What sort of extreme state had I entered? And how could that be explained by neuroscience? And people are trying to do experiments using this substance, and this is not an uncommon experience that I had. One of the great beneficial side effects was, as I discovered a few weeks later, that I totally lost, due to this experience, my fear of death. So, like many of us, as you get older, you sleep less well, and you lie in bed, and you think what happens after you're dead, and, living forever and ever and ever, You look down, like it's like climbing in the mountains, and you're looking down at this canyon, but it goes down, it's just like this existential canyon that goes down forever into infinity, and you get sort of existential nausea, existential dread. And all of that has been totally, and it's still true 5 years later, has been totally wiped out. So the other thing I discovered, so there was a long-term beneficial effect, that ultimately in that world, in that moment, the world had disappeared, and the only thing there was just this experience, close to what some people call pure experience. It wasn't totally pure because I had, the sense of terror and ecstasy. Again, which if you read the mystical literature, is not uncommon. In fact, this famous, what's his name, a German theologian talks about the tremendum mysterium. Or if you think about the etymology of the word awful in English, full of awe, it comes from that. Experience something completely overwhelming where you get both terror and ecstasy. So that was my near-death experience.
In the book, you talk about the dissolution of self and the knower merging with the known. But the big question for me is that if there's no more self, no more time, no more separation from everything, what being is actually experiencing in that moment?
Well, so I had a second experience that was, years later, a year and a half ago, way past midnight on a beach in Brazil, where I had a more classical mystical experience, in a sense where I became, I lost myself, a sense of self. I lost my body. I lost any representation of the environment, and I felt myself flowing out in becoming part of the plenum. I mean, my plenum was filled with stars. There was nothing but stars. So I felt, and thus the title of the book, Then I Myself, the World. I experienced becoming identical to the universe. Now, I know that sounds totally woo-woo, but that was my experience, right? And so the challenge is to, as a thinking person and a scientist, to try to reconcile what does it mean, this experience? What do I take home from it? What does that tell me about the biophysics, about the metaphysics of what exists? And one classical interpretation of such mystical experiences, of course, of idealism, that what truly exists is only the mental, and somehow on the beach at midnight under the southern sky, I tapped into whatever was there of my conscious, tapped into and became one with this whole. Now that's not amenable to scientific empirical verification, but it's certainly compatible with what I experience. So I became part of the whole for a brief moment.